Welcome to the Thin Places Travel Podcast, where we discuss places where the veil between this world and the eternal world is thin. I'm your host, Mindy Burgoyne. Coming up, we'll hear from Anthony Murphy, an expert on the history and mysteries surrounding the ancient monuments in the Boyne Valley in Ireland.
The archaeologists, by and large, don't talk about spirituality. It's not in their training. And by and large, they don't talk about astronomy either, because that's not in their training. That does not mean that the monuments weren't designed with those functions in mind.
Welcome to episode 13 of the Thin Places Travel Podcast. In this episode, I've interviewed Anthony Murphy, who is a historian and a journalist and a remarkable photographer who lives in Drogheda, which is north of Dublin. It's one of Ireland's most ancient towns. Drogheda is mostly in County Louth, but a portion of it runs over into the ancient capital of Ireland, County Meath. And that's where you have the Hill of Tara and the Boyne Valley monuments such as Newgrange and Knowth and Douth. Now, Anthony's written several books. He's also a husband and a father of 5 children. He has a full-time day job as a journalist, but in his spare time, he has a hobby of photography and astronomy and Irish mythology, especially as it pertains to the ancient monuments there in the Boyne Valley. And he is the author of a wonderful book that is really no longer in print, but it made a great impression on me, Island of the Setting Sun, In Search of Ireland's Ancient Astronomers. He's written many other books, but his most recent book is Mythical Ireland, New Light on the Ancient Past. And it features many of the same concepts and subjects that Anthony's going to talk about on this podcast. And he also has talked extensively about these subjects on his YouTube channel and posted much about it on his blog and on his Facebook page. This guy is full of information about the ancients. And we use Anthony as a local guide on some of our tours. I'm always amazed at the information that just pours forth from him. I recorded this interview in May of 2018, and Anthony speaks about Newgrange and the Boyne Valley and the ancient people. He talks extensively about the monuments and the Irish mythology. And we closed the interview, and I was to run it in the summer of 2018, several months later. But in July of 2018, while he was doing some aerial photography over the Boyne Valley using a drone, Anthony discovered a new monument. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The monument was visible because of the drought that Ireland was currently experiencing. He sent some of the video footage off to the RTE, which is the Irish network television, and they featured it the next day. And within several days, it had gone viral around the world. So it's an extremely wonderful opportunity for him to have seized, and a great credit to the hard work that he's done over these many years. But I couldn't air this podcast interviewing Anthony back in May without mentioning what happened in July. So this is the first interview of 2. Episode 13 features the interview I did in May. And then directly after it, episode 14 is another interview with Anthony where we talk about his discovery. So be sure to listen to that interview as well. Sit back and relax and prepare to hear from one of the most brilliant, fresh minds focused on ancient Ireland that there is. We are so lucky to have with us Anthony Murphy today. Anthony is a father of 5 children and a husband. He lives in Drogheda, and he is a specialist on the Boyne Valley monuments. Anthony's an author, and he has a wonderful YouTube channel, and he's so accessible with all the information that he has. I am so glad to welcome you, Anthony. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Mindy. It's great to be here.
Yeah, I would say you're the go-to guy on Newgrange, for me anyway. And I have a lot of go-to guys, so you should be impressed.
Oh, well, I'm honored. Thank you.
And of course, we've also had you, be a private local guide for our tours, and you're so full of information. It's just amazing how much you know. And of course, you've got a lot of that in your book. So tell us a little bit about what you specialize in. What is your passion here?
Well, the reason I sort of really started doing research around the monuments was because I was fascinated from a young age in astronomy and the stars and the sky, the sun and the moon and all the celestial phenomena. If you had asked me when I was younger, like when I was, in my early adulthood, if you had said to me, you're going to write books about Newgrange and the great monuments of the Boyne, I would have said to you, that's absolute nonsense, because all of the books have already been written by the experts. But I suppose over time I realised that those experts concentrated quite largely on the archaeological evidence, and there was much, much less written about the mythological aspects of the monuments and indeed the cosmological and astronomical aspects. And so in 1999, I hooked up with a local artist here in Drogheda, Richard Moore. He wanted to learn about astronomy, and he came to me because he had heard that I was quite an avid astronomer. And at the same time then, Richard knew quite a lot about the mythology of the Boyne Valley, and I suppose it gave me or instilled in me a passion for the mythology. We actually went on to publish a book together, which was my first book, Island of the Setting Sun, in search of Ireland's ancient astronomers. And really, I haven't let go of it since then. We started together in January 99, so I suppose we're not too far off 20 years down this road of, I don't know what you'd call it, investigation and research and, well, basically opening up to all sorts of possibilities around the monuments and especially the mythology. We're really so lucky in Ireland. We're blessed with an incredible array of stories through the texts, the mythology that was written down by the monks in medieval times, and of course also through the folklore, the stuff that has survived into recent times orally. So there's an enormous treasure of material there, a whole treasure trove to be explored.
Just in case there are some people listening that really don't know what the Boyne Valley is, let's just cover in basic terms Newgrange and the surrounding monuments, what they exactly are. If someone goes today, what are they seeing?
Well, Newgrange, Louth and Douth are three megalithic monuments dating from the New Stone Age, so approximately 5,000 or a little bit over 5,000 years ago. They really mark the zenith of achievement of a community that had arrived onto the island of Ireland approximately 6,000 years ago, so around 4,000 BC, and had constructed hundreds of these monuments. Now, the archaeologists call them passage tombs. They're also called chambered cairns. And basically what they generally consist of is, a stone structure, a stone corridor or a passageway leading into an internal chamber, or a multiplicity of those, covered over by a huge amount of cairn material, stones and earth. And Newgrange and Louth and Douth are by far the largest of these in Ireland and among the largest in Europe. So they're a very, very impressive monument built by a people who had very, let's just say, challenging lives, in that the people in the Neolithic died very young. They were a lot smaller and lighter than we are. And of course, they didn't have access to any sort of technology beyond what was made of stone and wood and bone. So there was no metal in those days. So what they achieved was quite remarkable in terms of the size. I mean, Newgrange has its giant curbstones, which are taken there by sea and river. They weigh an average of 3 tons apiece, which is the weight of an Asian elephant. And the cairn material at Newgrange is about 250,000 tons, just the material that's placed on top of the passage and chamber and covering the cairn. So we're really looking at a gargantuan effort to put these things together. And of course, the real excitement for the modern scholar is to try to follow the trail and ascertain what is the meaning behind them and what was the inspiration for their construction. And for me, that's where the most exciting path has lain.
Well, so let's just get the question that Michael Gibbons has posed out there, since Newgrange, as we know, it has, when you visit it today, there's a lintel over the doorway. So you walk into the passage, you go down into the tomb. It's very dark and away from any sunlight, but on the couple days either side of the winter solstice, when the sun rises, and it does send some light into the tomb. And there's been a lot of controversy about whether or not that light box has been reassembled. Do you have anything to comment on that?
Well, only to say that I disagree with Michael Gibbons. I think that in addition to the reconstruction of the roof box, which wasn't so much a reconstruction as a repair, because over the intervening 5,000 years, what has happened is that there's a settlement of the cairn and a subsidence of the cairn. But I mean, beyond all the archaeological evidence, and there's really no reason, I don't know if anyone else in the archaeological world disputes Michael O'Kelly's work at Newgrange in terms of the roof box. I think Michael Gibbons, as far as I'm aware, seems to be the only one. And look, he's entitled to his professional opinion. Beyond all the archaeological evidence, I'm most excited about the folklore that was present long before the excavation and restoration of Newgrange, that in fact pointed out that the sun shines in there on the solstice. And Professor O'Kelly himself was told this by the locals before the excavations.
And so just to clarify, Professor Kelly was the one that sort of opened up discovered and then sort of made it available to everybody by sort of reconstructing it or putting it back together. Michael Gibbons is an archaeologist. You were talking about the stories. You're more excited about the stories.
Yeah, I am, because you see, the thing that the archaeologists tell us about Newgrange is that within about 5 centuries of its construction, so sometime between around, let's say, 3100 BC and about 2600 BC, there was what they call a cairn collapse, or a subsidence of material. So all the cairn stones slipped over the edge. And what happened was the cairn became sealed. All of the curbstones were covered over and the entrance to the passageway was concealed. Now, the archaeologists tell us that this is the state that Newgrange was in for 4,000 years, and that it was in 1699 AD when the local landowner, Charles Campbell, had ordered his servants to go and retrieve stone from this cairn for the construction of his new house. He was one of the settlers who came to the Boyne Valley after the Battle of the Boyne, which had taken place nearby in 1690. And during their little expedition to retrieve stone from the front of Newgrange, his labourers first of all found the decorated entrance curbstone buried beneath all these stones, and then later the entrance to the passageway. And so we are told by the archaeologists that Charles Campbell probably became the first human being in about 4,000 years to venture inside Newgrange. And yet the folklore in the 20th century was saying that, well, the sun shines in there on the solstice. The difficulty is that, first of all, the roof box was completely blocked up. In all of the early photographs and in all of the drawings from the past couple of centuries, the roof box is invisible apart from the lintel at the top, the stone that you described earlier. And so really, at winter solstice, it was impossible for the sun to shine into Newgrange. And in addition to that, because I was saying earlier about the weight of the cairn pressing down on the stones, the roof slabs had subsided and the orthostats, the passage stones, had, I suppose, leaned in. And as the roof slabs came down, they basically cut off any light that might have come in if the roof box had even been open, which it wasn't. So the extraordinary thing is that the folklore appears to tell the story of the astronomical alignment of Newgrange, even though that alignment apparently hadn't been seen in over 4,000 years.
Well, talk about that. What is the astrological alignment of Newgrange? Is that like an entire book?
Well, no. The accepted astronomical function of Newgrange is that it is aligned such that the sunrise on the winter solstice shines through the roof box, up through the passageway and into the interior of the chamber. And in fact, the archaeological community, bar 1 or 2 exceptions, are content that that was a purpose of its construction. I personally believe it's more complex than that. I think it's a little bit simplistic to say that the Neolithic community operated by a solar calendar alone. And I think in order to effectively function, an ancient calendar has to have incorporated the movements of the moon and perhaps the movements of the planets, and to have been cognizant of the movement of the sun through the zodiac, through the ecliptic. So in addition to the fact that the sun shines into Newgrange when it's standing still, as it were, when its movement towards the south has stopped, Newgrange might also have functioned, as I refer to it in Island of the Setting Sun, a womb of the moon, a passage womb as much as a passage tomb, but a place where the full moon at summer solstice might have been visible, because, of course, the full moon is always opposite the sun, and there are certain times in the lunar cycles when the full moon's declination would be equal to the winter solstice sun's declination, and therefore it's an astronomical fact that there are times in the moon's calendar when it will shine into Newgrange. What does that tell you? The time that moon's light is visible inside Newgrange is a warning of possible eclipses, because if the moon is exactly on the declination of winter solstice sun and is rising opposite the sun, the thing is that the earth can get in the way. And if the moon is close to its node, as in where the moon's path crosses the ecliptic, then there is the possibility of an eclipse. And I think there's enough evidence to suggest that eclipses were studied by ancient communities. And the fact remains that lunar eclipses in particular, the solar ones are harder to see because you have to be located exactly on the strip,
Right.
the narrow strip of Earth where the solar eclipse is visible. Lunar eclipses, however, are entirely predictable and happen in patterns and sequences. Is this all too much for the ancient people to have taken in? I'm not so sure. In addition to all that is the fact that Joseph Campbell, the famous mythologist, in 1958 recorded a folk tale in the Boyne Valley that suggested that Venus, or the morning star, on one day in 8 years at the solstice, shone into Newgrange at dawn and cast its light onto a stone in the interior of the monument. It transpires that this is astronomically very accurate because Venus does, in fact, follow an 8-year cycle. Sometimes it's visible as the morning star and sometimes as the evening star. And it goes through this sequence where it's morning, evening, morning, evening, morning, evening. And that cycle repeats over a period of 8 years, after which it appears to do exactly the same patterns again for another 8 years. And during my research for Island of the Setting Sun, I used modern astronomical software, as it were, to retrace the movements of Venus and the sun and the moon, etc., in those times. And I found that there is actually only 1 year in 8 in the cycle of Venus where Venus is rising roughly in the declination of winter solstice sun in the pre-dawn winter solstice sky, and where it would be visible from the chamber of Newgrange. And then later that morning, maybe an hour and a half later, the sun is shining into Newgrange as well. And that only happens 1 year out of every 8.
That is very interesting. That is amazing. I did not know that. Let's talk about the mythological aspects of these monuments and how they're tied to the stories.
Of course I can. And of course, the astronomy and the cosmology is in there, for instance, at Newgrange. So in the stories, there are two sort of versions as to who owns Newgrange. In one set of stories, it's Elkmar, who's one of the two-headed Anon gods. And in other stories, the Brew, by the way, Newgrange is a 12th century Cistercian name for the monument. The Cistercians founded Mellifont Abbey in 1142, and they founded granges or farms. And some of those names survive: Newgrange, Rough Grange, Sheep Grange, and Little Grange. There are 4 grange townlands in the vicinity of Newgrange that are in fact Cistercian. Newgrange's ancient name in the manuscripts is Sheedinbroga or Sheonvru. So in other versions of the story, Dagda, who's the chief of the gods, otherwise known as Uchi Olahar, the great father god, or Dagda Mór, the great Dagda, was said to have owned Newgrange. But in the Dinshenachus, which is a collection of place name stories pertaining to the eminent places and where they got their names from, and again, most of this is recorded in manuscripts dating from medieval times. Christian monks in the monasteries of Ireland transcribed the myths into their manuscripts. The Dinshenachus describes how Dagda entered into the house of Elkmar, the house of Elkmar being Sheedinbroga or Newgrange, because he desired to lie with Boyne, who is Elkmar's wife. And he does this in conjunction with making the sun stand still in the sky. And what happens is Dagda lies with Boyne, she conceives a child. At the same time, Dagda has sent Elkmar away on an errand, and he casts a spell on him so that Elkmar will think that he's only been away for 1 day, when in fact he's been away for 9 months. And the son is born. His name is Angus Og, which means the young son or the son of the young. And because his mother says, apparently in the Dinshenachus, it says, young is the son who was conceived in the morning and born before sunset on the same day. Well, what I'm fascinated is about the scholars agree that Dagda is a solar god. In fact, we're told in the Dinshenachus that he looks after the crops and the harvest and the weather. He's described sometimes as being red-eyed, He's very much seen as a solar deity. He enters the house of Elkmar, which is Newgrange. In essence, we see a sort of a sacred union of sky and earth. Newgrange, as I said previously, Brug na Boine, Brug being a mansion or an abode. And I'm fascinated by a very similar word, which is Brú na Boine, as in the womb of Boyne. So Dagda enters into, and it is quite uterine, it's quite organic, it's like a birth canal, and the whole uterus is there and all the rest. We're supposed to see this as some sort of a divine union, and the young son is born as sort of a prehistoric immaculate conception, if you like. So the story about Boyne in the Dinchanicus would appear to contain a description of the winter solstice alignment in symbolic or metaphorical language of Newgrange. We're also told that at Douth, which is, I always say it's the third of the great monuments, and I suppose it's the third because Newgrange and Louth are accessible by the public tours today and have been excavated in modern times. And Douth is kind of overgrown and forlorn and a little bit neglected, which is, by the way I really love it, and I hope that never changes. But at Douth, we're told that there was a king called Bresal Bodibad, whose name means Bresal, who was lacking in cattle because there was a cattle famine at the time of his reign. But he commanded all of the men of Ireland to come and build him a monument, but they said they would only build it in daylight. So in order for there to be endless day, the king's sister actually cast a spell on the sun so that it would stand still in the heavens and that there would be endless day. Now, I've interpreted this in my work, especially in Island of the Setting Sun, as language which could be taken to indicate that the standing still sun refers to a solstice, in this case the summer solstice, unlike at Newgrange where we're talking about winter solstice, the summer solstice, because at summer solstice in Ireland, and for several weeks beforehand and afterwards, actually, what date is it? 25th of May now, from here until solstice and for a few weeks after, we have this eternal twilight at night. We don't get full darkness at night for about 2 months in the middle of summer in Ireland. And the more north you go on the globe, the longer your summer days and the shorter your winter days, until you get to the Arctic Circle, when in fact the sun will be visible basically all the day through. And so I think that this is the endless day of the story. But what happens is that the king, lust seizes the king, and he goes off and commits incest with his sister. And the spell is broken and a sudden darkness descends on the place. And the men, of course, say that, well, we were promised endless day for this task. And since day has gone and night has come, we're going to depart. And forevermore, this place shall be known as Duad, which is the old Irish Duad or Duad, the old Irish name of Douth, an anglicised version of that. And Duad means darkness. And I think that the union of male and female, again, could refer to the coming together of the sun and the moon in the sky for a total eclipse of the sun, in which the land would suddenly become very dark. And that codified in that story is a reference to not just the summer solstice, but also eclipses.
That's great. And that does explain what Louth, of course, is all built up and restored, and Douth is just left, sort of the way to the ruins that are left from that give you that sort of, primitive look where you can use your imagination a lot better than somebody else's imagination that has reconstructed it. Although, I love both of them. Those monuments are something that they're very touristy, and they have a lot of people, not so much Louth and Douth, but Newgrange is like Disney World. But it's so powerful that we tell guests, we stay away from as you know, in our niche, we don't tend to go to the heavily traveled tourist sites, but you can't not go to Newgrange. It's just too impressive, just if for no other reason, to get your perspective on what these monuments all over the country, really what their construction was like, so that you can imagine what they were maybe trying to do. I want to ask you to talk a little bit about in your new book, the new book that you have out. Tell us a little bit about that, because that has a spiritual side to it, spiritual aspect. You explore a spiritual aspect.
Yeah, I suppose it's difficult to explore the monuments and their associated mythology without trying to consider what might have been some of the underlying factors in their construction, which undoubtedly involve, as I have sort of often said, maybe a crossover between what you might call scientific study, the study of the movements of the sun and the stars, etc., and a sort of a spirituality. There must have been something that drove these people to such gargantuan efforts. And let me say at this juncture that we're dealing with a population who died very young. I mean, the average life expectancy of a male in the Neolithic is 28, and the average life expectancy of a female is 26. The maximum life expectancy is 45. So these are very youthful people who appear to be able to manage to do a lot of things in a very short space of time. Agriculture must have become fairly challenging for them, because we're told that the climate started to deteriorate in the Neolithic, and you can construct monuments when you have surplus food and when you have what we call, or what the archaeologists refer to as, a quiet time in the calendar. That's okay, but what leads you to such endeavours? I mean, okay, if you consider that they're tombs and burial places, important burial places, I don't know if that alone justifies the amount of labour and the huge distances over which materials were hauled to Brún na Bóinne and to the whole complex over a period of probably several generations of people. I don't think that cuts the mustard as, a singular explanation for why they were constructed. And so you get into the spiritual realm, which is, well, what else is there that moves people, this zeal that moves the community together? And of course, it's hinted at in the Dinshenachas myth about Doubt that the king commanded, or he brought all the men of Ireland to build him this tower from which he could reach heaven. And I think that's key to understanding these places that are described in the monuments as she. They're not called passage tombs in the manuscripts. That is an archaeological term. So what is she? It's a means by which they can pass to heaven, which is exemplified in Dinshenachas Doubt myth. And so what were they trying to achieve? I think they, in the spiritual worldview of the people of the Neolithic, they saw the interconnectivity of sky and ground, heaven's mirror, as above, so below. They saw how critical the movements of the sun were to their agricultural calendar. And of course, the Dagda is the one who, looks after the weather and the harvest. Well, that's no surprise as the solar deity. But beyond that, a hope perhaps for some sort of existence in the afterlife. Maybe the monuments were used as a means for communicating with the ancestors. The Druids, as it were, those who are mentioned in the early manuscripts, in the likes of the Laura Gawala, the Book of Invasions, that the Druids commanded a special respect among the community because, first of all, they had this knowledge, this predictive knowledge of what was happening in the sky. So a Druid could say to his or her community, the moon is going to turn blood red in 3 days' time. And if that happened, of course, that would make him a very powerful individual, a soothsayer, as it were, someone who was able to prognosticate the future. But in addition to that, I think I've written in my book, Newgrange Monument to Immortality, about how the whole idea of a dark tunnel or passageway opening towards the brilliant light of the sun at certain times in the calendar may be an effort to replicate or to enhance the afterlife journey. Now, in modern times, we're aware that a lot of people who experience near-death experiences or who undergo near-death experiences travel down a dark tunnel or a void towards a brilliant light. Now, the archaeologists tell us that the bones of the deceased or the fragmented remains of the deceased were placed in ceremonial basins in a lot of the passage tombs. And I suppose the idea that kind of comes through is that, they placed the bones there in a ceremony, but I think ultimately they hoped that the souls would be drawn out along the beam of the sun or the moon or the stars into some sort of heavenly otherworld, And of course, there's a whole different way of dealing with the dead in the Neolithic compared to modern times, which involves a very intimate ritual around the defleshing and excarnation and ultimately the dismemberment of the corpse before it is burnt, and the bone fragments are then washed and brought and placed in the ceremonial basins. So we're looking at a culture that had a very, very, very different way of dealing with life and death, and have had a very different view of the processes. And of course, if you look at the megalithic art and you see spirals and circles, I like to think that they thought of the process as a cyclical one rather than a linear one. As the modern rational mind tends to think in terms of a linear life with a beginning and an end. And the whole idea, I think, of the she is that we're not just talking about the placing of the dead, we're talking about the hope for some sort of rebirth that has taken place in there.
That's powerful. Why do you think people want to go to these sacred sites? They don't even know why. I can tell you, I take a lot of people to sacred sites and they know they're drawn to them, but they don't know why. They don't really know why. They want to keep going back. And obviously you want to keep going back. I want to keep going back. Why do you think that is?
Well, I don't think I think that's a very, very good question, by the way, but I don't think you could answer it with one single sort of statement. I think that for some people, there's definitely a whole numismatic thing where they feel that there's a power in a place that perhaps isn't explicit there. So sites like Newgrange and Louth and Douth and the Hill of Tara, for instance, and Loughcrew, I suppose they engender the sense of a sacred space in people and maybe a liminal space. And I think the reason that a lot of what we call the passage tombs or the chambered cairns, the She, elicit that sort of response in people or that sort of experience in people is because of where they're constructed. So they're generally constructed on ridges and hills and upland areas. So if you've been to Brickleave Mountains or if you've been to Loughcrew, you really get the sense of being detached from the telluric life, from the terrestrial earth, as if you've been elevated towards something, almost as if they were saying, this is an effort on our part to reach out towards the heavens. Unfortunately, a lot of people are involved in revisionism. So I suppose, they sort of invent their own little story as to what the monuments might have been about, which mightn't always agree with the archaeological evidence, etc., etc. However, it has to be said, in fairness, and I suppose the reason I've been able to do my work is because the archaeologists, by and large, don't talk about spirituality. It's not in their training. And by and large, they don't talk about astronomy either, because that's not in their training. That does not mean to say that the monuments don't have functions or weren't intended or they weren't designed with those functions in mind. So She on Vrue, Sheed in Broga, which is built by the Dagda, is not a place where life ends, as it were. It's a place where perhaps life begins again. The Tuatha Danann were said to have migrated between this world and the next world using the monuments. And in fact, when they reached their accord with the invading Milesians, they decided that they would allow the Milesians to occupy the surface land of Ireland, but they themselves, the Danans, were going to inhabit the She. And to me, that gave them an extraordinary power, which was, in actual fact, I think it prolonged them, it deified them, it maybe immortalized them. People who come to Newgrange, Louth and Douth experience all sorts of emotional responses. I've seen incredibly powerful responses from people. Can I say that those responses are not genuine? Of course I can't. In most cases, they're extremely genuine. They might not be cognizant always of the mythological or the archaeological history of a place. But when a scholar, and several scholars have written that the monuments reflect back what you bring to them, I think in essence that's part of what they do. And maybe that's partly what they were designed to do. And isn't that the essence of spiritual belief in the first place? That everybody differs in their beliefs. Some people come to the Boyne Valley who actually believe that the Tuatha Danann are gods and that they're living and immanent presences. Others, like myself, I believe it's much more a metaphorical thing, but at the same time, the myth seems to record some aspects of the history of the site. From my own point of view, my exploration of the monuments coincided with a fairly sort of hefty spiritual challenge in my own life, which is detailed in my book, Newgrange, Monument Immortality. And I think that the rise of interest in the ancient and sacred sites coincides with a sort of a spiritual and economic and political collapse that happened in Ireland in the past decade. And it's no surprise that there's a huge rise of interest in the ancient, not just in the ancient sacred sites, but in the mythology around them and the beliefs around them. I would be inclined to say that I'm agnostic and that I don't have enough proof to personally dissuade myself from the idea that there is an afterlife or that there may be deities and gods, nor do I have enough proof to explicitly say that, yes, there is an afterlife or there are gods or there aren't, whatever, I find that a very comfortable position from which to explore these places. The first and foremost thing in relation to a person's experience of a place is if they are able to have a spiritual experience there, if they have a sense that they have entered a space that is, let's say, liminal. Liminal is a very, very good word because, I always think of liminal as meaning suspended, as it were, somewhere between this world and another reality. Well, if you can suspend yourself in that space, they can have quite a profound effect on you. And I can tell you the profound effect they've had on me over half a lifetime of study is they've had a very, very calming influence. And I would say overall a very benevolent and positive influence on my life and I think on my personality, actually.
Well, that's pretty powerful. So let's try to sum that up. When people come to these places and they're moved, or they feel some kind of energy, or they feel a power in the landscape that they don't understand, or they maybe are standing in that liminal space and can sense a shift in energy, why is that good? What do they do with that? How do they really benefit from that?
Well, I'll tell you the reason I think it's good. I think it's good because it's not so much, you get all sorts of rationally minded people, scientists, who maybe want us to move away from the idea of mystical experience. And I think that I think what we have to do as a civilization, actually, for the benefit of ourselves and for the planet, is to move away from the idea that, mythology is explicitly recorded historical fact, which I think is a great problem with religion in the world. And I think we must make it a more sort of experience-based thing. So it's much less about the rules and the dogma and the regulations around what you should and shouldn't do with your beliefs, and much more down to a person's own intimate and personal relationship with the divine space. What does that mean? I think that the reason it's good for people to experience these things at these sites is it puts them in a moment of immortality and perhaps gets them in touch with an eternal aspect of their own natures, takes them out of the linear mindset that says this life is short, it's, you have to survive and you have to live and you have to do this and you have to do that and you have to follow all these rules and all these rules and all these regulations, and it's head spinning. And all of a sudden a person finds that they're elderly or they're ill and they're dying and they are full of regret because they haven't experienced their life and they haven't lived to the fullness of their capabilities. Martin Brennan, who was a scholar on the ancient megalithic sites of Ireland, particularly in relation to the interpretation of the megalithic art, in a video, which I think is probably still available on YouTube, he visited the Anubis cave, which is somewhere in the States. And he made reference, and I've referred to this in my book, Mythical Ireland. He said that I like to get in touch with my eternal self, that which doesn't move. On the one hand, you can think of that as, sort of new agey, wishy-washy claptrap. On the other hand, I'm inclined to think that that's the sort of experience that the people who built the monuments were after, and the sort of experience that we should indulge in our own existences, which, after all, are so forged and forced and coerced into a particular set of beliefs and a particular set of behaviors. And we need to have that mystical experience. I think it's important as part of our nurturing to have some sense of divine experience. What is that? It's something that really can't be, I think, empirically described or outlined, because it's different for every person. But as I said, I've seen it. I've seen people arrive, and I've seen people who appear to have deeply moving experience. I've seen people weeping and crying, and I've seen people full of extreme joy having emerged from the tunnel of Newgrange for the first time. It's quite a powerful experience one way or the other. And of course, you'll always get people who aren't maybe emotionally expressive, but when you actually get talking to them privately, they'll tell you that they mightn't appear to have had a significant experience, but when they describe it, then you realize that it's been quite powerful for them. Look, the other thing is it takes us away from the humdrum.
That's true.
Where most of us in the West, we live in towns and cities, we commute, we do these jobs, we experience stressful lives, we experience probably an element of conflict around us. We see the difficulties that people are engaged in their daily trudge. In Ireland, there's a significant sort of a spiritual upheaval has been taking place for the last 20 or 30 years in conjunction with the slow decay of the Catholic Church here. And of course, people are looking for an alternative. Perhaps they're looking for an answer that they're never going to find, which is what happens to us when we die. And to me, that is the biggest question that was asked by the monument builders. And their constructions were an attempt not to necessarily answer the question explicitly, but certainly to create something of permanent nature in a very, very fleeting existence here on Earth. And I think that nuministic experience that people have at these sites, or they undergo at these places, enters them into that space, albeit briefly. and gives them sort of some indication that, well, hang on a second, when you step back a little bit from this civilization and this life that I lead and this persona that I have and this ego, and you step back from it a little bit and you put yourself into a sacred space and you just try to experience that for a few moments, it is possible to think, yeah, maybe, just maybe after I die, I'm going to live on. Maybe I'm going to be reincarnated. Maybe I'm going to live forever. Or maybe I'm just going into a hole in the ground like everyone else,
It's true that there's this place you hang in the center of belief and disbelief that's sort of the state of wonder, where you're open to wondering. And I think there's value in that, and in the wondering and just asking the question.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's see. How can people find you? If they want to find all your stuff, where should they go?
Oh, well, probably the best place to start is my website, which is Mythical Ireland, and it's mythicalireland.com. Or you can also find it at mythicalireland.ie. If you're on Facebook, you can find me, and it's very easy to find. It's facebook.com/Mythical Ireland. I've done quite a lot of videos and short films over the year. Most of them are, amateurs. They're not necessarily professional productions, but people seem to really like that because it gives them a sort of a visual, and some of them with a combination of music and the visuals gives them that sort of little bit of mystical experience. So I'm on YouTube. And again, it's the same, youtube.com/Mythical Ireland. I'm also on Twitter and Instagram. But if you're looking to get in touch with me, the primary means would be through the website, and there's a contact page there.
And your new book is Mythical Ireland, New Light on an Ancient Past. That is your new book?
Yep, and that is named after my website, which was established in the year 2000. Mythical Ireland, New Light on the Ancient Past was established as a means of disseminating some of this information that myself and Richard were excitedly discovering and rediscovering on our own sort of journeys into the whole thing. And it was published by Liffey Press. It's available on Amazon. If you want a signed copy, then please buy it through the website mythicalireland.com, because I will personally sign it for you and send it to you if you're looking for a signed copy. Yeah.
Well, I want a signed copy, so I'll just go to your website, or maybe I'll just see you in September and get it then.
Yeah.
And you've been a wonderful guest, Anthony. You're so full of information. I could listen to you. Oh, actually, I have gone to your YouTube channel and listened to you quite often. Thank you so much for being with us. And
thank you for having me.
I hope to see you soon. And best of luck.
I'm looking forward to it.
Okay. Take care.
Thanks very much, Mindy. All the best now.
We thank Anthony Murphy for being so generous with his time and for offering such wisdom to you, our listeners. Please tune in to the next episode to hear about Anthony's recent discovery of more ancient monuments in the Boyne Valley and how the discovery was made and what those monuments tell us about the people of the time. I want to thank you for listening to the Thin Places Travel Podcast. You can find me on Twitter at TravelHags and on Facebook at facebook.com/Thin Places. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please give us a quick rating and a review on iTunes and consider subscribing. Thank you for listening. And please be sure to check out our tours to mystical sites at thinplacestour.com. The music for this podcast is Native Spirit, performed by Cheryl Ann Fulton from her collection, The Once and Future Harp. Goodbye for now. Wishing you love and light and every blessing.